As I'm learning new front-end frameworks, one of the things that I always like to try to do is create a JSON Explorer. JSON Explorer takes an arbitrary JSON payload, parses it into a JavaScript data structure, and then renders it to the page. So if we go ahead and hit Explore JSON, what you can see, it pretty prints the JSON back to the text area here for some easier editing. It persists the state, the essentially serialization to base 64 of the JSON payload into the URL, so that if I refresh, I get the same thing. And then it recursively renders the data structure to the page. And you can see I have my object here. As I'm hovering over, you can see there's little calls to action, the highlighting there, and that's because I can collapse all of these things. I can collapse entire sections within the tree. And if we refresh, they all come back. The other thing we can do is you can see that some of our strings here are actually embedded JSON payloads, metadata here. In fact, if I double click on this value, it will get parsed into its own little subtree of data structures. And the nice thing about building this is that it's small enough in scope that it's very doable. It feels very tractable, but it is sufficiently complex so as to help me explore the edges of the JavaScript framework. We have recursion here, and that was actually a huge stumbling block for Alpine. They don't have a native recursion solution. And then there's a whole bunch of different types of data structures that have to get rendered here. And there's form bindings. So it's sufficiently complex. And let's go ahead and just take a quick look at how this is working under the hood. So as I just had mentioned, a big stumbling block here in allowing me to build a solution for this was the recursion. And what I was able to do was create this custom directive in Alpine.js, this template outlet, which takes a refs, this is the magic refs, and this is a template reference. And you can see here I have the template xref node template. And I was able to create this custom directive, which allows me to render this template and apply this binding. So when I parse that JSON payload in the form here, that gets stored into this parsing result. And what I'm doing is I'm mapping that parsing result onto this value property. And that value property is going to be consumed by the node template. But before we look at the template, let's just jump down to the JavaScript to see how the form gets handled. And you can see there's quite a bit of code here. And that's one of the adjustments with Alpine or with any kind of non-componentized framework, is that you have a lot more co-located code since you don't necessarily have a natural way to divide and conquer your HTML layout. Anyway, I have my app controller here. I have my form JSON payload. And if we jump to the top here, we can see that in my text area, I have my X model. So I'm doing two-way data binding to this JSON payload. And then when the form is submitted, I call explore JSON. If we jump down to this, explore JSON, again, this is where I'm just trying to find the edges of how I understand Alpine to work and what I'm capable of doing with that. So the first thing I do is I set the parsing result to undefined, and then I allow a tick to take place. A tick in this concept is the resolution of the internal view model, the data bindings and the directives, with the actual HTML rendering. So by setting this equal to undefined, it allows Alpine.js a moment to essentially destroy the entire DOM. And then in the next tick, I can parse the JSON payload again back into that data structure, which gets fed back into the DOM. So it allows me to not have to worry about how this value is getting propagated down through this recursive tree, because I was actually having some problem with the resolution there. Meaning that, let's say I rendered this, and then I went and I created a new JSON payload and I hit explore, nothing would happen because I wasn't having a good way of propagating that new value down into that recursively rendered tree with all the template outlets and the data bindings and the mappings from one value to another. And we'll get into more about why that's complex, but let me refresh to the old data structure. All right, so we have our parsing result. And if we jump back up here, we can see that if the parsing result is not undefined, so we have a parsing result defined, I'm going to initiate my recursive rendering using this template outlet. I'm going to say that parsing result maps to value. So internally, node template is going to expect value to exist. And that becomes important because when we start to reference this recursively, we have to provide the same type of binding, but the right side of this assignment operator will be different. And we'll see that in a minute. So if we come down here to our node template, this is the recursive template. I have a JSON node. It gets its own little controller. And then what I have to do is look at the type of data that I have. Do I have a simple value like a null or a Boolean, or do I have a complex value like an array or an object? Now we can't just use something like xShow to differentiate between the types of values, because we consume those values in very different ways, meaning we might have to iterate over array elements, and we can't just hide that if it's not an array, because we'll have some weird data references, like you won't be able to iterate over a simple value. So I'm using the xif, and I'm checking on the type. So if it's null, I have my null header and my no value, and the button here is so that I can toggle it, and then I'm showing it if it's not collapsed, and that's for this kind of functionality where I can toggle it on and off. String is the same, Boolean is the same. These are very simple numbers, the same. Let's start getting into something that's a little bit more complex. And here's where we get the recursive nature of this exploration. So if the value type is an array, then I have a little header here, and that's this header that collapses the entire array. And if that is not collapsed, then what I have to do is loop over the value. So in this case, again, that value, and just to reiterate here, that value is being defined, at least initially on the outset of the recursion, as this parsing result. And then if we come back down here to array, we know that the value is an array, so we can loop over it. The sub value is the element within the array. The subkey here is the index. And then I'm going to recursively render that array element using the template outlet. I'm going to be using the same node template. So that is actually the node template that we're currently rendering. But this time, instead of passing the parsing result as we do at the top of the demo, I'm passing in the sub value. So as we're iterating over the array, the sub value is the element within the array that I am recursively rendering this node template, and I'm passing in that element as the value, so that when this template goes to render recursively, this will be the value that it uses at the root when it's making its decisions. We do the same exact thing for object, only we use a slightly different iteration approach. If we're in the type of object, not sure why that's getting a weird color coding. If we're in the type of object, again, we're going to iterate over it using the x4. This time the sub value is the value, and instead of having an array index, we're having an object key. But again, we use the same exact thing. We're using our template outlet here, and the sub value in the object becomes the value that we are recursively rendering. And that is how we're able to have objects of arrays of objects. And in fact, we can have some fun where, let's just do this a bunch of times. I have no idea if that's the right number. Let's see. Yep, we can just go arrays of arrays of arrays of arrays of arrays, and it all just kind of works. And then we can throw a little object in here. Reparse, and you can see that's now an array of an object. And internally, we can do null and true. All right, we can do false. We can essentially do any kind of valid thing here. 3, that's a JSON structure. So yeah, again, I had to find some rough edges in Alpine. I had to create some custom directives in order to unblock this solution. Most relevant, I had to create that template outlet directive for the recursive template rendering, and that allowed me to finally get this done. So very cool stuff. Alpine.js is pretty cool, and I'm able to start to bend it to my will a little bit more effectively.